Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 34 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Calgary Flames, in which the Sharks have lost 7-3. So in a strange oddity of the schedule, the Sharks have played their last two games against Calgary, but not in back-to-back fashion, and not in home-and-home fashion either. Both of these games were in San Jose. Usually when teams go for the dreaded, or I guess it's not so dreaded anymore, California road trip, they'll play San Jose, they'll play the Kings, they'll play the Ducks in any order, and then maybe they'll get in a game against Vegas or a game against Arizona before heading back to wherever they came from. But for whatever reason, the Flames actually managed to get two games against San Jose on this trip. And the major question that now stems after these two games have concluded is, which of these games did the Sharks look worse in? Because in my previous review, the 5-2 loss, I mentioned how that was one of the worst performances from the San Jose Sharks this season. And now here tonight in this 7-3 losses, this game is also worthy of that award. This was another awful game for San Jose, and making it even worse is how this game started. In last game, the Sharks gave up 2 goals within the first 30 seconds or so of the third period. Here tonight, they did that in the first period, which is like 10 times more demotivating if you're a Sharks player, if you're a Sharks coach, if you're a Sharks fan. Basically, if you're anyone related to the San Jose Sharks organization and you're watching this game live in person or on the TV, this is the type of start that just makes you want to turn it off, and I do not blame anyone for doing so, because even these 2 goals were just disastrous and embarrassing for San Jose. At the very least, the 2 goals that were scored quickly in the third period of last game, one of them was on the power play, and so it is like slightly more acceptable. But here tonight, not only were these 2 goals at even strength, but both were off of terrible defensive zone turnovers and terrible defensive zone coverage after those turnovers. And it's just 30 seconds in, you're down 2-0, you're playing awfully already. You don't even want to continue with this game. But here I am, having continued watching the game, and while the Sharks would actually score 3 goals and eventually get this game tied up again, it was kind of a situation where you're just sort of waiting for the Flames to get their next goal and waiting for them to take back the game. There was technically an opportunity for the Sharks to steal a point at some point in this one, just because of the fact that they did manage to get those 3 goals, but realistically this was the Flames' game to lose, and they did not do so. They would end up getting 4 unanswered at the end of the game. Now, to move through it a bit smoother, the next goal would be from San Jose, Nico Sturm, off of a defensive zone giveaway by the Flames this time, one of the Sharks' only chances in the first period as a whole to make it 2-1. Heading into the third period, the Flames would expand their lead to 3-1 before the Sharks would bring it to within 1 in the last 30 or so seconds of the second from Barabanov, and that was a potential momentum shifter, I guess, going into the third period. And within the first 4 minutes, it was Timo Meier who tied the game up at 3, but Calgary was having nothing of that. They were able to get control back of the game within a few minutes or so. Kadri would make it 4-3, Lucic would make it 5-3, then an empty netter would be scored to make it 6-3, and eventually even yet another goal on a manned net this time, with Reimer back between the pipes to make it 7-3, and that would be the loss for San Jose. So like I said, this one certainly joins the pantheon of terrible games for the San Jose Sharks this season. There are honestly a decent amount of those, which is no surprise for a team that find themselves 4th last in the standings. And just, it was a hard one to watch, and I'm sure there are many people who are watching this current review right now who didn't even watch this game after those first 2 goals. Moving on to the players to talk about, of course, this was a game that kind of just didn't really seem like one that was going to go well just coming into it because of the suspension to Tomas Hertl. He was going to miss this game and the next one, the 2 games prior to the Christmas break. And as such, joining Meier and LeBanc on the first line is none other than the master of falling upwards, Nick Bonino. From him being deserving of like a fourth line center spot at best and probably a healthy scratch to now finding himself on the first line center is not a testament to how he has turned his season around or anything of that nature. It is just a testament to both how the coaching staff favors him so heavily for no reason, and a testament to how little depth that the San Jose Sharks are actually willing to work with. Now, I cannot say that the depth that they actually have, because there are multiple players in the minors that the Sharks could technically call up to try and fit in a situation. I mean, how exciting would it have been to see Meier and Labanc get centered by Thomas Bordeleau here? But because the Sharks are just adamantly refusing to call up any actual useful players from the minor league, we do indeed get stuck with Nick Bonino on the first line, and surprise, surprise, not much actually happens with this line through the first couple of periods. There's like a chance or two from Timo Meier trying to do everything himself, but Bonino does nothing offensively. Labanc was also rather invisible this game, and by the time the third period rolled around, we already saw some line juggling, as Meier was instead joined by both Couture and Barabanov on that first line, as essentially trying to load it up. And you could say that sort of worked out, as of course Meier did get the Sharks' only goal of that third period with this line change. So I guess there's that. But the major issue because of that is that with Meier being joined by Couture and Barabanov on the first line, that turns the Sharks' second line into Labanc, Bonino, and Nieto. And may I remind you that last season Labanc didn't even play or barely played because of a massive injury, and realistically he's the type of player who could occasionally look like a first liner. He has at times done that this season when paired with Hertl and Meier, but there are also many times throughout his career where he looks barely like an NHL forward at all. And then of course Bonino and Nieto are basically fourth line players who on a good team like a Toronto or a Boston might not even crack the top 12 for those teams, and yet this makes up the San Jose Sharks' second line in the third period of this game, and it just shows how fragile the San Jose Sharks' top six currently is, where just the suspension of Tomas Hertl, where he misses 2 games, basically causes this lineup to fall apart. It is essentially held up with sticks and tape and all of those very, very flimsy type of materials, and just a stiff breeze suddenly causes it to all come tumbling down. The San Jose Sharks, they managed to score 3 goals. That is very impressive, but that came with essentially zero offensive pressure, zero forechecking, zero offensive zone time, pretty much nothing like the tools that you would expect to try and score 3 goals, and this was kind of a minor miracle that they even managed to do that. So the second line that came together in that third period did very, very little. There was this one nice Matt Nieto chance that he had near the end of the game, but even then, not too much. When it comes to the third line, we had Gregor get boosted up with Sturm and Svechnikov because, of course, Bonino got boosted up because, of course, Hertl is out of the lineup. I will also mention that usual third liner Luke Kunin actually going to be missing the pretty much the rest of this season, I would say, since the Sharks are not going to make the playoffs, so he's not going to be like a potential return there. He's likely going to miss the rest of the season at this point, so decently sized loss for the San Jose Sharks. Kunin was an okay enough player. At the very least, he was an NHL forward who could play technically some top 9 minutes, and the Sharks don't have too many of those, so it will definitely be a loss for this squad. But moving on to the actual third line performance here tonight, I thought they were not great. Sturm did score, and he actually had a couple of decent chances, but besides those very one-and-done opportunities, like I mentioned, the Sharks did not have any offensive zone time, and this line was no exception to that rule, found themselves pretty much entirely in the defensive zone. This was one of those Gregor games. Gregor is one of the most inconsistent players on the San Jose Sharks. He will go 3-4 games in a row where he'll have like actually some really solid chances to score, maybe even actually contribute on the score sheet with a goal or 2, and then he'll just have like a game or 2 where he'll be literally invisible. You will not notice him even for the briefest of moments, and this I felt was one of those games. Gregor was essentially not even playing, wing, and that's going to be a tough one, and it's one of the reasons why he finds himself moving in and out of the lineup a lot thus far this season. When it comes to the fourth line, this was actually one of the more effective lines for the San Jose Sharks. Lindblom draws back into the lineup after being a healthy scratch, and this was one of Lindblom's best games of the entire season, I would say. Nothing amazing, didn't score, didn't get an assist or anything of that nature, but he actually had a couple of solid plays. This was one of the few lines that actually managed to get a couple of decent shifts in the offensive zone. I thought Laurent continues to be pretty solid and really the driving factor on this fourth line, and with the fact that Lindblom is actually, having a good game here tonight, it really helped bring this fourth line together. Now, of course, it didn't really matter in the end, but still nice to see, especially since it was only a few games ago where the fourth line was genuinely terrible. On the defensive side of things, it was not good for San Jose when it comes to Erik Karlsson. At the very least, in the previous game against the Calgary Flames, I mentioned how it was classic Erik Karlsson with really bad defense, but at the very least also having really good offense. Here tonight, the offense was okay, but nowhere near what it was in the previous game, and the defense, it may have even been worse than it was in the previous one. Karlsson just looked very much checked out in certain plays. I felt as though he was more dejected in the defensive zone than he usually is. I mean, he frequently does sort of try and turn things offensive very, very quickly, and so you'll see him kind of not necessarily involved in the defensive zone play, but I felt as though it was even more so turned up to 11 here tonight. Not a good game from him at all, and he was actually joined by a new partner here tonight. Scott Harrington gets boosted from the third pairing to the first, and Megna ends up getting sent to bench. I don't necessarily hate the fact that Megna was a healthy scratch, but Harrington wasn't very good last game, so to then reward him with this promotion to Karlsson doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense for me. And also, Karlsson is one of the most volatile players on the San Jose Sharks, and so to switch up a pairing that had been together for very, very long and that had been doing pretty well together, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to me, because clearly there wasn't a lot of chemistry between Harrington and Karlsson, and that was a massive issue for the San Jose Sharks because, again, how volatile a type of player Karlsson actually is. If you're not going to have that chemistry, if Harrington's not going to be able to cover for him and things of that nature, it's going to be a disaster, and a disaster it was. On the second pairing, it continues to just not be very good here. I thought in particular Vlasic really struggled here tonight. Benning was not good, but he was somewhat salvageable, his performance. Vlasic genuinely may have been the worst defenseman for the San Jose Sharks here tonight, besides maybe Šimek or Karlsson, depending on how you view Karlsson's game, how much the offense kind of outweighed the defense. He was definitely quite bad, but Vlasic, there was no offense as expected, but his defense really struggled as well. And then when it comes to the third pairing, we saw Ferraro return. I didn't think Ferraro was great, but I don't think he was either terrible. He was mostly dragged down by Šimek, who I did think was rather bad, and just generally this was just a really rough game for the defense as a whole. And then when it comes to between the pipes, we had Reimer returning after an decent but not great outing from Kaapo Kähkönen in the previous one where he lets in 5 goals. Sharks were likely hopeful that Reimer would be at least able to do a bit better than that, and that didn't actually end up being the case. And in fact, you may argue that Reimer did worse, primarily because of the fact that he let in 6 goals and not 5, but also a couple of these goals definitely not looking too good. In particular, the Lucic one, which was extremely back-breaking, was a terrible goal to let in, but also the Kadri one that made it 4-3. That one was slightly difficult, but still one that you'd like to see your goaltender make, especially since you had tied a game and you were trying to keep yourself alive in a game that you had no business being in. You want to see your goaltender, be able to make that save and also help out in that particular effort, and it just wasn't really there. So not a great game from James Reimer, but that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday for their final game before the Christmas break. That will be against the Minnesota Wild, and we'll see if the Sharks can really steer this course sort of in a slightly more positive direction, because these last couple of games have been extremely difficult to watch and not fun at all. Class dismissed.